Hi friends, welcome to another live Q&A here at the University Church. Today you are in for an amazing treat. I know that some of you have really enjoyed these Q&As and they keep getting more and more interesting, and we have very, very fun guests that join us. And this week you've got two amazing guests that are going to be joining us. Pastor Randy is out for today. He's not going to be on, so I have brought two of my very good friends to join me, Dr. Ariel Roth and Dr. Danilo Bošković. And so we'll introduce them here in a moment. But as we always do, we love to hear where you're watching from. And this is the question for today. What makes you the most excited about family and loving each other? So give us a little insight into your life as we share about ours. So and also, if you can do one thing, would you please share this right now before we jump into our discussion? So click that share button if you're watching on Facebook, and then click the URL link, highlight it, copy it, and send it off to some friends. That always helps in getting the reach of our Q&A experience out to as many people. I want to give you a hearty welcome to those of you who are in Loma Linda and those of you around the country and even the world. Every week we have people tuning in from all walks of life, Africa and Asia, and man, even in South America, the islands all over the world. So we are just so grateful for your partnership with us. So with no further ado, I want to invite my dear friends and even Dr. Roth's wife with us today. So welcome, friends.
Hi.
Hey.
Hello.
And we've got now on Ariel's screen, Dr. Ariel Roth. His beautiful bride is with him. Leonore, hi.
Hi.
Hey, now we want to tie this sermon in really closely. Pastor Randy spoke about love and how this is one of the key components for the future of the church. Now, tell us, how long have the two of you been married?
68 years.
Oh my goodness. Now, I thought Ariel just had his 23rd birthday, but that just won't work.
No, it won't.
So, thanks for trying.
Oh my goodness. Hey, now tell us, how did you two stay in love for so long?
Well, I tell you, marriage has its ups and downs. Ours has been singularly peaceful. But when you make God primary in your life, other things become secondary. And it's not hard to stay by what there is. But when you have such a lovely wife as I have, there's no problem.
He's a very patient man.
Wow, I love it.
Isn't it beautiful to find something to admire in one another?
Yeah, well, Lenore is a very patient person and puts up with all my oddities and peculiarities without saying a word.
Hey, now I'll tell you this. When I was visiting with these two, Lenore told me, she said, Philip, we absolutely love being married to one another. And even after 68 years, it's still exciting. Is that true?
That's true. It's true.
It's especially, it gets more exciting as you get older. And you're more and more dependent on each other.
Oh, wow.
So it grows.
Wow, I love it. I love it. Well, you know what? You two just made a beautiful connection with our sermon, and we just want to thank you for your faithfulness in marriage. It is so incredible that you guys have been together for so long. It's a testament to those of us who are a little bit younger. I've been only married 11 years. So thank you, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we want to say hi to some of our visitors and guests who are watching with us right now. And so we'll kind of go through and just say hi. We've got Ricardo, happy Sabbath, he says. Goodwin, happy Sabbath, everyone watching from home here in Adrian, Adelanto. Happy Sabbath from St. Lucia. Wow, Jean, so glad you're with us. Lola watching from Redlands. Hey, we love you, sister, and your awesome husband. Brina watching from Oklahoma State. Hey, welcome. Glad you're with us. Del Weber, we're so glad you're on. You are a faithful watcher. So good to see you, sister, from Toronto. Brianna watching here in Loma Linda. Christy Decker from Western Maine Foothills. And she answered my question. She said, family makes me the most happy when I realize that those asleep will soon awake forever and will never have to say goodbye. Amen to that one. Happy Sabbath from Portland, Oregon. Sonia, glad you're with us. Oh, Amari Karonto, zdravo I sretna subota tebi. Drago mi je da sam te video tu sada. That's a little Yugoslavian for you. Danilo understands. And we've got Sue from La Center, Washington. Hey, Monica Klein from Orange County. And James Peter Henry. Hey, brother, good to see you, man. Glad you're here. This is a good friend of mine from Los Angeles, wonderful artist. So why don't we jump into our Q&A then now? We have two incredible scientists with us. You probably should both just tell us a little bit about your academic background and also your interest in faith and science. And that's going to be kind of our introduction, and then we'll jump into a few questions. Why don't we start with Dr. Bošković? Just tell us a little bit about your kind of academic background.
Oh, I'm a protein biochemist. I work here at Loma Linda in basic sciences of the School of Medicine. And the subject that really draws me and has drawn me all my life has been this quest for understanding. The reason is quite simple. As far back as I recall, from the earliest childhood, I somehow, from my parents, gathered the idea that you can't just accidentally, by chance, have good things happen. For good things to work out, somebody somewhere had to have worked to make it good. This is where many people who see evil and conclude that there is no God fail to realize when something goes wrong, that is not the challenge we have to explain. What we have to really explain is, why do things go well when they go well? You see, that because that requires the real effort. It doesn't require much effort for things to break down. That will happen on its own. But for things to actually function as they should, that requires explanation.
Wow, what a good point. That's a great point. Well, Dr. Bošković, welcome to the panel. Thank you, brother. And everyone can already see the caliber of question and discussion we're about to have. Dr. Roth, tell us a little bit about your academic background and kind of what interests you in faith and science, like Dr. Bošković did.
Well, I obtained a degree in zoology from the University of Michigan quite a while back, like 1955. And after that, I became very intensively interested in creation and evolution because of what I'd been taught. And even before that, the issue used to come up in family discussions and so on. So, but I could say for at least about 73 years, I've been intensely interested in this issue. And I was chairman of Department of Biology at Andrews for a while. Then I chairman of biology here, but my interests got fulfilled when I started pursuing studies in geology, which relate to the flood and the geological interpretation that the start, at least the scientific community has a very different idea than the biblical model that most of these layers are laid down by the flood. So I trained myself in geology there for several years at the University of California, and then was the director of the church's Geoscience Research Institute for some 16 years, and since then I've been doing the same thing. In fact, just last year published an article in a peer-reviewed geology journal about some of my studies, and I try to keep active.
I actually was lucky enough, Dr. Roth, to get a copy of your article. Here it is. Now, what everyone here doesn't realize, this is a 93-year-old emeritus professor still writing and getting published today. That's amazing. That's amazing. And I happen to have, and I know that Dr. Bošković has been published in many articles and magazines as well, and a lecture and many panels and conferences. So we're just really grateful to have both of you here today. Pastor Randy spoke about love in part of his series entitled 7 Ideas That Could Save the Church and 1 More That Could Change the World. Now, we're going to take a look at love through this lens of faith and science today. And I believe that faith and science is an idea that, if grasped and understood within the character lens of God's love, might just be a beautiful realization for many who have become skeptical about church, and even those who are just simply skeptical about faith, period. So I'm really excited to hear from both of you today. Our first question kind of highlights a little bit of the topic Pastor Randy spoke about in terms of love and the relation within the church. And so this is the question. How does love and God as creator relate to one another? How does love and God as the creator relate to one another?
Well, I would say, God would create in order to have love. If you're all by yourself, it's kind of lonely. So that seems to be an essential part of getting love, is to be able to create.
Great point. And it seems as though when we look at the concept of the Trinity, God always existed within a communal aspect of love. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. So I agree with you in that sense, that creating was an outgrowth of the love that Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit had with one another. Great point. Dr. Bošković, what do you think about this?
Well, it strikes me that creation itself is an expression of love. You create because love creates. It's what love does. Love is creative. And there are many different ways for that creativity to express itself. So it's not surprising that we procreate as a result of our love. But it's not only that we procreate, we also labor. I mean, even when we work with our babies, we put in an enormous amount of energy working and caring for them. Why? Because we love them. How can you not? It's an expression of love, and so all labor is actually an expression of love. And one of my mentors said, you can never be good at anything unless you love what you're doing. If you don't love what you're doing will not work out well.
Yeah, very true. I
So
also think of,
to just think about the amount of care and love that God put into the creation of life is simply, well, it's a mind expanding concept.
I also think of, we discussed this at some point, I know, Dr. Boshkovich, where you also brought up how God's character is perfectly represented in his creation in reference to love.
Mm, yeah, yeah. It, well, as the Gospels tell us, God is love. So everything he creates, he does so that that same love would fill our hearts too. And when Christ prayed for his disciples, he prayed that they also would love one another as I am in you, as he's praying to the Father, so that they may also be one.
Yeah,
This
yeah.
is remarkable. You see, it's
And that
God
verse,
a vision for life itself.
yeah. And that verse itself, I think, speaks so poignantly into our generation today, where when you are living out the love of God that he has for you, the world will recognize the Father because of that.
Yes.
So it is
And
so
he
important.
actually said that.
Yeah, yeah. It is so important. Well, let's talk a little bit about science. So some people would say, or maybe the question should be asked, what is the role of science? Because some people would say science really doesn't do a very good job of loving. What might you have to say about that, Dr. O?
Well, that's very correct. Science is the study of nature, trying to determine the cause and effect of the changes we see in nature and so on. But there are many areas that science doesn't do very well in, and one of them is love.
Mm,
Uh, Science can measure the effects of love, like measuring your blood pressure and so on, but that's not measuring love itself. Uh, Take ideas like love, our consciousness, our conscience, our free will. Uh, these are all areas that are beyond the realm of science, and science doesn't do well in those particular areas. Science is a limited look at reality, and you must not use just science for reality because you'll be ignoring certain areas that exist that need to be included in the equation.
mm,
So the obvious conclusion is that science can help us, and it does many wonderful things within a limited sphere of operation. But when it comes to love, it doesn't do very well.
Well, we're all learning.
yeah. Now, you both know this even better than I do. The role of science has shifted in society over the last maybe 150 years. And it used to be a lot more connected with faith. Some of the greatest scientists of all time were men and women of faith who not only believed in God, but some were even pastors and ministers and lived in monasteries.
Yes. Yes.
What happened? How is it that the role of science took a completely different shift away from, I guess you could talk about these inanimate characteristics of love and hope? What happened?
Well, science redefined itself. Now, let's make it clear the term science is not that old, but the action of science, the activity of science, redefined itself. The pioneers of modern science, I'm talking about these geniuses like Isaac Newton and Boyle and Pascal and Linné, uh, these all believed in God. They included God in their explanations. They did excellent science, including God in their explanations. They established many of the principles of modern science, which tells you you can do very good science if you include God in the equation.
Mm.
But Darwin came along, and before that, Chambers in 1844, Darwin in 1859. These they produced some monumental documents that kind of stimulated the scientific community to go off by itself. It went off by itself, excluded God out of the picture, and since then has been trying to explain everything without including God.
Mm.
It is not a good way to arrive at truth if God exists, you understand. In fact, it will mislead you. You will not arrive at truth, you'll arrive at conclusions that tend to fit. And of course, the theory of evolution is a prime example of this, a theory that's been debated for 150 years. There seems to be no resolution to the main idea that everything developed by evolution. Of course, organisms change. You know, we have microevolution. That does occur. Most scientists and creationists who believe in the Bible and so on agree, no, there's small changes.
Well,
But the major changes, major problems, uh, there isn't a good resolution here to this thing. And this issue, it's not settled at all. And the more details we're finding about the origin of life in fossil record, so the more sure we can be that evolution does not work.
Mm.
well,
But the general theory of evolution does
yeah.
not work.
Even the instruments and machines that we build are built with some capacity to adapt to changing conditions. That is what extends their functional competency. Why should life be different? Why can't life have the adaptive capacity to changing circumstances so that it can actually be preserved as much as possible? That seems to me an implicit requirement for life to actually be reasonably resilient.
Mm.
Otherwise, everything would collapse in record time. The first time there was some kind of crisis, all life would just collapse. How would that work out?
Hmm. Now, what both of you are pointing to is something where some people don't realize what you're maybe referencing, but this notion of microevolution, in the sense that there is adaptability of nature throughout time, but it isn't in such a way that one organism now becomes a completely different organism. Is that right?
Well, what is actually needed for such a thing to happen is that one organism would need to gain the necessary information to become a different organism. So where is that necessary information going to come from?
Mm.
Clearly, it had to be somewhere, even if it was introduced somehow. It had to come from somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's look at the fossil record connection with that. The fossils are preserved by accidents of nature and so on over the billions of years. You should be able to find a rather continuous series of fossils through these billions of years that evolution followed. You look at the fossil record, you do find intermediates, or at least things that are called intermediates, and scientists get quite excited about these. But these are invariably related to closely related relatives, which may be microevolution, may be other interpretations.
Mm.
When it comes to the major groups, you don't have the intermediates. In fact, the larger groups, there are no intermediates between our major phyla.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it doesn't look as if evolution ever took place.
Yeah.
It's it's rather obvious, and in addition to that, most of your animal file develop only in, well, it depends on different interpretations. They scientific time interpreted, they would say maybe 5 to 10 million years is a period where most of them arise. During the other billions of years, you don't seem to have any evolution to speak of, and you don't have the intermediates between them and these 5 to 10 million years. The intermediates are not there. But
Yeah.
everything seems to have risen more or less rapidly, and the flood kind of explains it quite nicely.
Well, let's get to the flood here in a moment. Don't jump the gun now.
I just thought I'd slip it in there because
Good, good. So now what I heard you saying is that you believe there is a slower, or not slower rather, but you're saying there was a rapid ascent to life, and this notion of the evolutionary model where you have billions of years that it requires to make things just doesn't exist in terms of the fossil record if we talk about science.
Yeah.
So that's very helpful.
yeah, for 3 billion years, essentially, what is interpreted as life, and some of it could be life that came there later and so on. That's another issue.
Okay.
But
Okay.
for 3 billion years, you have virtually no evolution to speak of anything. Then all of a sudden, you have the Cambrian explosion. Almost all your animal phyla appear at about the same time. This is not evolution. This is creation.
I like it. You're saying there was a moment in time when all of living reality emerged.
We're
Where-
talking about the time of geological interpretation.
I see.
No question. Creation was in 6 days by God, according to the biblical interpretation.
I see. Hey, thank you for that. Let's go to a few of our comments, and then I'll jump to you, Danilo, here for a moment for another comment. George Havor says, before the creation of the universe, there was only the Trinity in existence. There was only the Trinity. Undoubtedly, they fulfilled each other's needs within the Trinity. If their aim was to achieve ultimate happiness, nothing else needed to happen. There would never have been a universe. Yet Trinity decided to share the joy of existence by creating the universe. I like that.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And then our other commenter here writes in a 3-part comment, Inspired Choice says, science is good when it doesn't overstep its boundaries and talk about things it can't grasp yet, as if it was on top of them. And science is limited until now in integrating all knowledge for ecological well-being. But science may help love as it may empower. Interesting.
There is a relationship between faith and science. On one hand, for faith to function, it implies a given trust. We have to be able to trust. On the other hand, science means knowledge. So, how do we connect trust and knowledge? Well, you see, for us to gain the knowledge, we have to be learning something. Trust is the bridge between not knowing and knowing. It enables us to learn. Why? Because it first is necessary for us to trust even our own senses. so we can experience life and make sense of any of that. That's how we begin to learn something. That's how we begin to acquire the knowledge. But if we do not trust to begin with, how is knowledge supposed to work without us having the very tools to learn it? Do you see there is a logical disconnect? If we divorce faith and science, we're undermining science itself. There is a logical disconnect there.
Wow. Now, one of our comments here came in from Dana Johnson. She asked a question to the two of you saying, what do the panelists think of a growing tendency in Western society to reject the scientific method and expertise and to see truth as subjective?
I would say that's very bad.
Terrible. That is rejecting both trust and knowledge. And what do we have then? All we have is just our own inclination, our own will, and our own undisciplined feeling. What is that? That is mush.
Truth ought to make more sense than error.
That's right. We should be able to learn something. You can't not learn something and think you're growing. That's nonsense.
But science works only, or mainly we should say, with the natural, the simple, the cause and effect type of thing. It does ignore a vast area that I mentioned earlier of information and of experience that it does not touch.
The entire Bible speaks about the essential requirement for humility. If we do not have that, whatever conviction we've got is worthless. If we don't have humility, whatever we imagine that we know is worthless.
Now, do you think that there is a place in which people can say, I know this to be true, I will build my foundation upon this? How do you know that there is truth in its capital form that people can say, hey, I can rest on this while still being humble enough to say, I don't know everything, but this I do know. I can stake my claim on life on this. I believe God exists. I believe in the resurrection. I recognize Jesus died on the cross for my sins. Like, how can you say something is truth in a Western culture where people say, nah, I don't know if I believe that. I believe this, but it's fine if you don't believe that.
Of course, there are all kinds of degrees of truth, but whether we're dealing with a scientific theory or dealing with the Bible, we have to a certain extent, exercise a certain amount of faith if we're going to say this is truth. If our minds are open to all the information, it's pretty hard to say there isn't a God. It's not unreasonable to think that God would communicate with us. It's not unreasonable to think that communication is the Bible. And so it's not blind faith there in that case. But getting back to your question, no, it's society is moving into agnosticism, relativism, and so on, and it's not doing very well. Face the fact, it's not doing very well.
It's unfortunate that right now many people think of believing in God as uncool. I'm reminded of the research study done by Barna Research Group in a book entitled "You Lost Me," the reasons why young people are leaving the church. And Barna, the president there, David Kinnaman, wrote in the book that there are 6 reasons in which why young people leave the church. And one of those that he said was, many young people believe the church is anti-science. What do you think about that?
Well, most of the educational institutions, both in North America and in Europe, were actually built originally by religious institutions. So, how on earth did we get to the conclusion that religion is anti science? I suspect it is probably because we have not taught or exemplified humility adequately. And here is the problem that I feel that both the how should I say, atheists as well as theists need to learn something of value. Whether God exists or doesn't exist is not dependent on my opinion of it. So, I have a choice of exploring the concepts and the questions in order to learn something. I do not have a choice on defining how reality is. Because we're not the definers of it. We're merely, if we're worthy, we're merely discoverers. That is a huge difference. Unfortunately, in some areas, we as human beings have chosen to somehow ascribe to ourselves the rights to define what is real and what is not, as if reality will somehow change in response to our opinion. That is silliness.
Yeah. Very good point.
That is the ultimate in pride and lack of humility and our inability to actually see our proper place in reality itself.
One other factor we might mention is that science is good. It works well. It tends to run off into interpretations at times that aren't correct. But as far as taking care of ordinary things, it is highly successful. I mean, I mentioned electron microscopes or satellites and so on. There's no question science is highly successful.
We're discovering things all the time.
At that particular level.
Huh?
And but it's a fairly simplistic level. But because it's so successful there, it's not so hard for the academic community to try and reject the Bible because they've got something they think is more successful. But that's no way to arrive at truth if the Bible is correct or if God exists and so on. And the present trend is a limiting trend and not a good one.
Yeah. You know, I approach this subject with some pretty significant sensitivity as a young adult pastor. I get to work with some very intelligent, bright young students. And you both especially know this. You mentor these young, brilliant scholars. Many of them come to our institution. Some of them, I would say at least, maybe from a more skeptical position. Others come from a very religious background and believe in the Bible and more of this notion that there is still mystery. And there is this blessing of the miracles, that these things really did happen. I approach it with sensitivity for this reason, that I don't think dogmatism in a negative sense where someone is just so harangued, no, you have to believe this. If you don't believe this, you're an idiot. If you don't believe this, you're just not a thinking person. It can really come from both sides, the faith side and the deeply empirical method side of science. And I think what you both have said, this notion of humility, is very important. And I think as a church, we need to have room for those who doubt and for those who are still questioning and still trying to understand how faith, science coincide when their universities have taught them for all these years that this is a myth. Faith is a myth. The miracles are a myth. Creation is a created ideology. It doesn't really exist. So I think when church members, professors, teachers, from a religious standpoint, approach these students who are young in their faith, I would always just say, please go about it with sensitivity. Go about it with a sense of humility and thoughtfulness when you engage them.
Approach it with an open mind. To say, well, to a person, well, I believe the Bible by faith. That does not say very much to a person who likes to reason things out. And on the other hand, there is plenty of evidence to suggest that the Bible is special. I'm speaking of its geographical authentication, its historical authentication, its prophetic authentication, and the necessity that science points to some kind of designer to have produced what science discovers. You can. The rational approach seems so much more satisfactory to me than the blind faith.
Yeah.
If you're talking a blind faith, in my opinion at least, it takes a whale lot more blind faith to believe in evolution than it does to think things were created.
May I say something about this blind faith issue?
No, don't say anything.
Well,
I want
here's
to
the
take it
problem with it. Both the religious and the atheists feel that if they were to contemplate anything outside of their conviction, that they would be somehow failing their faithfulness. Here is the problem with that. Implicit in that kind of position is the idea that faithfulness is somehow fully embodying only obedience. So I do not want to dislodge this idea from my mind, because then I will be disobedient, and I don't want to be disobedient. However, there is more to faithfulness than mere obedience. If our children, as they were growing up, took our word for it, but never bothered to learn what the reasons are behind what we tell them, we would be concerned. If they merely took everything on face value, we tell them something and they immediately do it, even though we think that would be a miracle. Here is the problem. The other important component of faithfulness, besides obedience, is also study, discovery, learning, application of effort to understand. It is when you love someone, you want to know them better. You want to understand them better. You want to know what the reasons behind what they say or do are. You don't just want to take whatever happens to be sprouted off first and take that as the ultimate goal. It is not. It is growing together that makes the difference.
Great point. Great
So
point.
merely being faithful in the sense that we've got our convictions and we're not changing our mind, don't confuse me with facts, that attitude is already a rebuttal of humility. And it is not only against humility, it is also against all learning. We cannot grow that way. That's no way to move forward.
Yeah. Great point, Dr. Boshkovich. I would, were you going to say something, Dr. Roth? I was going to go.
No, go ahead.
Well, both of you are scientists. You believe in science. You have studied science. You've dedicated your life to science for more than I have even existed. You are men who are reputable in your areas, in your fields, in your institutions. So what you're saying is not that science does not have a place in the world. You're giving science its rightful place by what you're pointing out. Many people don't recognize that the Bible kind of points to this notion that there would be in the end times kind of this falling away of belief in God. I want to read to you 2 Peter chapter 2 and verses 3 through 6. Dr. Roth brought this up to me some time ago, and I want to share that with you, and then I'd like to hear from both of you about it.
I think it's chapter 3.
Chapter 3, yes. 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 3 through 6. And here we'll put it on the screen for our viewers as well. Above all, you must understand that in the last days, scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, "Where is this coming he promised? Ever since our ancestors died, everything goes on as it has since the beginning of creation." But they deliberately forget that long ago God's word, the heavens came into being and the earth was formed out of water by water. By these waters also the world of that time was deluged and destroyed. Let's talk about these verses here for a moment. It mentioned that in the last days there would be this forgetting that creation actually happened, forgetting that there's a creator.
Well, these days it seems like people generally want to only have their particular opinion heard and validated, not to actually be discovering anything or learning what is actually true.
This forgetting about creation is obviously been fulfilled in prophecy. It tells you that this book, that the Bible, and Peter specifically, was able to predict what was going to happen in the last days. And since, for the past century and a half, mainly the past century, essentially, education has downplayed creation, and it's not even allowed in many schools and so on. And Peter predicted this would happen in the last days. And it's rather remarkable, and tells you the Bible is no ordinary book.
Now, how does Revelation, the Church of Laodicea, almost relate to this as well?
Yeah, it talks.
Lukewarm.
Yeah, you say that you're rich and require nothing. But you do not realize that you're wretched and miserable and poor and blind.
Wow.
That is frightening. And it's the exact opposite of humility. Isn't that fascinating? The same concept keeps coming back. Whether we're religious or not is not as big a determinant of how close to God we are as how we relate to truth.
Wow. I like what one of our comments came in from Synth Pinkney. She watches faithfully, and she writes the following. I want to read this to you. She says, maybe it's not that deep. People have always walked away from God. It's the reality since man was told not to eat of the tree of good and evil. People just want to do what they want to do. The world looks exciting and sin seems sweet. All the forbidden things that we grow up with needs to be done. Whenever I talk to people who have walked away from the church, they never mentioned not believing in God. They just got tired of the don'ts. What do you think about that? Synth is saying, hey, it's not that people stop believing in God. It's more so they get tired of the religiosity and the rules and the ways of doing godly things.
We have freedom of thought, and we tend to believe what we want to believe. That's why we need to always check our thinking against valid sources of information. And I would mention the Bible as one of them, and I would mention the data of nature and correct scientific interpretations as also part of the picture. We need to constantly check, make sure that we're on the right track.
I like
Well, how many of us have not had some difficult days? It's difficult to, how do I put it, to be cheerful when you're having one of those. And what happens when you have a string of those challenging times? I see people who have had very difficult times, particularly right now with COVID, who are perhaps out of work, who have perhaps not had any income, who are perhaps looking at the possibility of being without shelter, not to mention where am I going to get the next meal. And so under those circumstances, you can see how it is difficult to have the joy of the Lord.
Yeah, I gotcha. Hey, now
in that context, on the other hand, you have instant gratification advertised and offered. All you have to do is just get this drug or that particular fix or whatever, and you have instant thrill. So now what's required of us is that we distinguish between what is real and what is fake, regardless of how pleasant it may be.
Very good point.
One of the fortunate things here is that the Bible portrays a God who cares about us, who's doing everything possible to save us, and who will answer our prayers sometimes. In different ways he answers us and so on, but we have that help if we want to avail ourselves of it. And we have plenty of evidence to know that that can work. I think most of us have seen our prayers answered sometimes, and sometimes I think it's a very good thing that God doesn't answer all our prayers. We would have no freedom of choice if we asked God, what color tie should I wear today? But God does answer our prayers.
Yeah. I like how James Peter Henry, he comments here at 254 on YouTube. He says, kind of in conjunction with what you just said, Dr. Oath, I believe that when miracles happen in your life, you understand that God is the creator of all. Until that time, it's hard to see the full power of God.
But what happens when we're in the shoes of Job? How do we go through those times of difficulty and still keep the head in its rightful place and still think soberly about things?
Yeah.
Rather than resort to a quick fix of some kind.
Sure.
We can also finish reading the book of Job. It comes to a good end.
Yes, that's 37 chapters later.
Yeah.
Good point. I also like what Joseph Mann here at 254, he wrote, the fateful difference between quote unquote believing in God and knowing Jesus as Lord and Savior. He kind of answers Synth's point saying, hey, listen, there's a difference between someone who really knows Jesus as their Savior and someone who merely acknowledges that he exists. Very good point. I want to get to just two quick questions here before we're finished. I know that these are going to be big ones and you won't be able to say too much, but many people acknowledge God as the creator of nature, creator of the things that are in the universe. But now what happens when nature becomes destructive? When that which God had set in order becomes the act of evil, you could say. So this is the question. If God is love then, and God created nature, why is nature this way? This comes from one of our listeners.
Well, I think one of the explanations for that is that a lot of this destruction that we see in nature is the result of man's sin. In Genesis, God did not want to destroy man, but man had become so wicked that he upset the earth, and the earth has been upset since then. We have volcanoes and the flood itself, of course. Uh, these are the result of man's sin, and God is trying to save as many people as possible and teach us all the lessons we need to learn if our minds will be open to alternate possibilities. But there's no question there's suffering out there, but a lot of it is due to the fact that man became so wicked just before the
Yeah.
flood.
Yeah.
If I may say something, Jeremiah chapter 12 talks about how Jeremiah was lamenting to God why he allows all the wickedness and destruction to be going on. And God answers Jeremiah and tells him, if you can't keep up with the pedestrians, how are you going to keep up with the horses? What was he meaning by that? He was saying, if you can't deal with the minor irritations and, frustrations in life, how are you going to deal with great evil that I have to deal with? It is good for us to keep in mind that God has a much bigger picture, and
Yeah.
that is to protect and immunize the entire universe against evil,
Yeah.
as well as to rescue us.
Yeah. Yeah.
So if we have a little bit of inconvenience here and there, it is not that big an issue.
Yeah.
We have the privilege of actually being alive during this historic occasion,
Yeah.
when whatever we do or say actually may have some kind of impact.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I know this is a big one to throw on you here at the very end, okay? But Christy Decker brought this up, and I know we wanted to talk about this one. She said this at 2:40 on YouTube. Does modern science admit that there has been a worldwide flood?
The answer is no. Uh, the part that they ignore gives a great deal of evidence that the answer should be yes. You look at those geological layers, extremely widespread, very thin layers. Chenier conglomerate, for instance, is kind of a rock sandy layer, 100 feet thick on an average, spread for 100,000 square miles. It's in 6 different states.
Wow.
This is catastrophic activity on the basis of stuff that we can't imagine not present right now. Now,
So-
just one small example. Look at the layers of the Grand Canyon. Extremely widespread flat layers. Many of those layers spread over most of the state. This is catastrophic, just as you'd expect during the flood.
So this isn't when you think of the flood, you're not saying it was just simply a localized event that happened in one little area. You're saying this was a global flood that covered the earth then.
Why have a local flood if you're going to build an ark and put all the animals in it because the animals might die off? No, this was universal. The Bible is clear. All the mountains and the whole heavens were covered. Regarding that, and my reason, as I mentioned, why have a flood, local? Why build an ark if it's just a local flood? You're not, and there are many other reasons you could suggest, but these widespread layers are found all over the world. And so it looks like it really done catastrophically.
Aren't there paleocurrents that have been reported continent-wide, all in one direction?
In general, North America has flowing direction in one direction, the sediments. And then to add to that, I might add one particular point that I have emphasized many times, that between some of these layers, according to geologic time, there are layers missing in various places. But you don't see the erosion you'd expect if it was over geologic time. Flat on top of each other, three major ones in the Grand Canyon, all those layers are flat. You don't see that erosion like you see for the canyon itself. It doesn't look that like geologic time took place. There is good evidence that there was a worldwide flood, and that most of the fossiliferous layers that we have are the result of that flood. That's why the fossils were so well preserved. Wow. Pretty rapidly.
Wow.
We don't preserve most fossils. If a deer dies out in the woods here, he's not going to be preserved. You have to be buried rapidly, and they're there as evidence of the flood.
Wow. Wow. Well, both of you, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your input on this subject. What a joy it was to talk to you about love, faith, and science, and how this all ties together. I know our viewers were definitely blessed. Yes,
Could I just add one thought?
Yeah.
Some Christians feel that they can somehow save God and Christianity by adding evolution into it. This cannot be done without robbing God of creatorship. But if God is not a creator, then he's just another person who wants to be in charge. And how's that any different than anyone else? Do you see the nature of this problem? You may think that you're solving one problem, but you're creating a far deeper one.
It would be a strange kind of God who would create certain animals at a certain level, then they'd be destroyed, then they'd create more advanced forms later on, and they'd be destroyed, and so on. This is not an intelligent God.
And then at the end, come and say, "Thou shalt not kill."
And at the end, come and tell us in the Ten Commandments, keep my Sabbath because I did it in 6 days.
Yes.
He didn't. So many things don't fit with trying to mix the Bible and long geological ages, progressive creation, or theistic evolution models, and so on. There's good data that supports the Bible.
Wow. Wow. Hey, thank you both so much for that. I have to just leave our viewers with a few resources that they can take a look. So this one happens to be Dr. Roth's book. This is called Science Discovers God, and it's the 7 convincing lines of evidence for his existence. And then there are several others. This one I would recommend to those of you who have some very, very, very academic friends who are really questioning the existence of even a creator, period, this would be a great one to start with. This one is called Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. He wrote this from a very academic standpoint, so give this to those friends who are more of those academics. And then a few other kind of resources that were written by some Adventist professors. I think you'd like this one. This one's a very simple read, but very good. This is called Beginnings. Are Science and Scripture Partners in the Search for Origins? Leonard Brand with David Jarnes. I got to read this one back in college, so some good reads for you. There's so many more. My shelf is actually full of science and creation books. Several of my professors wrote some amazing books, but there's so many out there. Hope that each one of you gets a moment to take some time to think about some of these subjects. And we'll see you again next week, next Saturday, same time, same place. And this time it'll be with Pastor Randy and one of our local colleagues here in ministry. So thank you, Dr. Roth. Thank you, Dr. Boshkovich, and those watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye.